Welcome to the Exploring the Faith YouTube channel. My name is Cole DeSantis. I'll be your host today. Joining me is Dr. Jordan Cooper. He is the director of the Just and Sinner publication company and the host of the Just and Sinner podcast. He's an ordained Lutheran pastor, I believe, in the Missouri Synod. Am I correct?
I am actually in a small church body called the AALC. And we're a sister body of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which means we're in fellowship and we're both part of what is the broader group of confessional Lutherans internationally called the ILC. So we're a sister church of the Missouri Synod, but not identical with the Missouri Synod.
Awesome. And so basically you've written a lot on the interaction between the concept of deification and the sort of Orthodox Lutheran theology, and you sort of represent seem to represent a larger trend that's really emerged in Protestant theology and Western theology in general in the past few years, where it seems like a lot of people are starting to become more interested in the concept of theosis. So I just thought that's the topic we're going to be covering today, and I'd like to thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, like with any conversation on a sort of high level, or complicated theological concept, it's always good to begin with definitions.
Sure.
So let's begin by me asking you, how would you define the concept of deification in its broadest possible terms? And then we can narrow in to talk about specifically a Lutheran definition of
Sure.
deification.
Yeah, sure. I've got really two books that I've written just for background here on the subject, and the first of these is Christification, which is probably the most well-known one. More recently, I wrote this book called Union with Christ: Salvation as Participation, which gets into some more specific details about this particular topic. And when I wrote Christification, this was back in it's about 10 years ago. I think it was 2013. Is that right? I don't know. I have a hard time remembering when I did what. 2014. All right, I was close. But I remember that when I had written this book initially, that was probably one of the most difficult things was how the heck do I define theosis? Because it is such a multifaceted concept, and it really is a concept that encapsulates all these other concepts too. What I ended up doing in the book was I ended up settling on just using Norman Russell's definition, who I know you had just spoken with, but I do think that he probably had the best kind of comprehensive definition. But for the sake of maybe not just repeating his, as I did in this book to start us off, I would maybe start with the most basic of all definitions, and that is that deification is simply what St. Peter says in the book of Second Peter when he says that we are partakers of the divine nature. So in the most broad sense, I would say that any notion of theosis or deification is simply the outworking of what does that mean. So if we're going to define it at the most basic level, it's the recognition that we are partakers of the divine nature. And just to maybe quickly make one clarification there. When we say partakers of the divine nature, for that to really be theosis, I would say we have to mean something more than we imitate the moral or ethical character of God. It has to be, in order for this to be an understanding of theosis or deification, we have to understand this, at least in some sense, in a participatory way. Like there's a real ontological, I guess, union or sharing in the divine nature.
Awesome. And so that's an interesting point because when you talk about deification in that way or in those terms, it doesn't necessarily seem like a uniquely Eastern concept. But the thing is, very often our theology is determined by the situations, the concrete context within which we find ourselves in. And
Yeah.
among the church fathers, you know, you see people like Irenaeus responding to the Gnostics, Athanasius and Cyril responding to the Nestorians, and both of them, all of these figures were highly influential in both the East and the West, because they laid the basis for a lot of the church's modern Christology. But because these were figures in the East, the Eastern Church was maybe a little bit closer to the cultural or ideological context that produced someone like an Irenaeus or an
Sure.
Athanasius or Cyril. Whereas when you look at the theological debates and historical circumstances that led to the rise of Protestantism, they were at best really assuming what was said by people like Irenaeus or people like Athanasius or Cyril or any of these other people. That really wasn't the source of debates
Right.
between Catholics and Protestants. And so, unfortunately, deification in the West in general, but including in Protestantism, was really something that was neglected. So, but in the past few decades, at least since, in my understanding, since the 1970s, I believe, there's really been a renewed interest about concerning the concept of deification in Protestant circles, and especially in Lutheran circles. So, can you explain what the impetus is? Because with anyone who knows a little bit about church history may be like, this is interesting. A Protestant's talking about deification. So, what were the situations that led to this sort of renewed interest in deification among Protestant or specifically Lutheran circles?
Yeah, I think there are probably a number of factors that go into why it is that it was particularly in the 1970s that people really started talking about this. But usually the the impetus behind this is, when people are explaining where this came from, usually it's the fact that there were ecumenical dialogues going on between the Finnish Lutheran Church and the Orthodox. So, because there was an Eastern Orthodox Lutheran dialogue going on at the time, there were just questions that naturally arose because they were talking about salvation and talking about, well, what do Lutherans do with this concept of theosis? What do Lutherans do with deification? Is there a place in our theology for it, or not? And this led Monerma to then a reevaluation of some of Luther's writings, largely the Galatians commentary, 1535 Galatians commentary of Luther. It wasn't just that, though. There were a number of other writings of Luther that were being examined there as well. So I guess if you're going to give one kind of historical event that's going on, it is that those ecumenical dialogues. But the 20th century as a whole was very much a time for ecumenical dialogue, right? There was much more kind of inter-Christian communication that was happening and trying to hash out particulars of what do we really disagree on, what do we actually really agree on. You have this with Vatican II, for example, being the most kind of obvious example, but this is happening to some extent with the Eastern Church at the time as well. And these discussions have only increased, I think, in the Western world as the Eastern Church has an attraction that I think is drawing a lot of younger people, especially younger men, at least in my experience, to orthodoxy. So these are just kind of naturally questions that people are going to be asking, I think, today, because people are looking into orthodoxy, whereas Eastern Orthodoxy was, I think, for a time was probably more a bit of a niche for certain ethnic groups. In other words, it didn't have the same kind of broad reach that it probably has today. So
Yeah.
that's a lot of it, but I also think that there are probably some other reasons beyond just conversations with the Eastern Orthodox. Well, that might be maybe the most significant element of this. I would also say simply that I think a lot of the problems that the modern world faces, thinking about things like just the isolation that people have, the loneliness people are feeling today. Theosis as a concept, I think, really helps to answer some of the unique problems that we're facing today. So some of it, I think, is also just kind of practical or pastoral, that there are needs that seem to be arising that do, I think, require that discussion of a participatory notion of salvation, and something that is not only I'm a big proponent of forensic justification. I am a Lutheran after all, but
Yeah.
not only the forensic elements. I think that those certainly address questions of guilt, but a lot of modern concerns or questions aren't just questions of legal guilt, and theosis really helps to address those concerns.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one thing that I've noted in my research on Lutheranism and the Lutheran and the more general Protestant view on theosis, and you had mentioned this a while ago, how there seems to be a little bit of a mystical element to Luther's
Yeah.
thought that I think is neglected. And so now, sort of transitioning from the broader understandings of theosis to the more specific, I think one way to make that transition to a uniquely Protestant definition of theosis is by looking at um, the like sort of reevaluating the Lutheran view on justification. And as you just said, the notion of forensic justification, this is really something you see emphasized a lot. The notion of forensic justification is only part of the picture. You see the notion that Christ is the form of faith, that through faith,
Yeah.
Christ becomes present um, in the soul. And it's not just the effects of his work. And this is something you emphasize in your work. And this is something that a lot of, like, in the Scandinavian Lutherans have emphasized. I remember one writer said, faith takes hold of Christ in such a way that Christ is the object of faith, or rather, not the object, but so to speak, the one who is present in the faith itself.
Yeah.
That's a very different way of thinking about faith, that you have faith in Jesus. So do you like to expound upon that notion and how Luther would have understood Christ as the sort of the faith of faith? Or
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot there that could be talked about there. First, I just want to say that the forensic element of salvation can coexist perfectly fine with the participatory notion. And I think that we have this very, very much a false dichotomy that sometimes happens in some of these conversations. And, I see this in at least a lot of the very, it depends on the Eastern Orthodox person you're talking to, because I think that there are plenty who do recognize as well some of the forensic elements too. But especially when you see some of the very polemical, kind
yeah,
of anti-Western, Eastern rhetoric that you find in certain maybe overzealous converts, I would say,
yeah,
which is there's no forensic element at all to salvation. Salvation is participating in God. And then on the other hand, I think you do have some Protestants that would reject that and say, no, salvation is all forensic. And I just say, I don't see any reason why we can't have both.
yeah,
I think that they're simply two elements of the wonderful gift of salvation that God gives us. And I would say that both of those elements stand side by side in the church fathers. I think Athanasius has both. He can speak of the language of debt when he's speaking about the death of Christ. He doesn't seem to have any issue with that. So I think that the notion of debt, debt being paid, that kind of Anselmian type of language with both forms, both the Protestant and Roman Catholic understandings of salvation in many ways, that certainly can totally stand side by side with these other notions as well. So there's no reason why they need to be pitted against one another. And yeah, so for Luther, he uses that language, that Christ is present in faith itself. That Luther sees faith not simply as, this is, I think, a misunderstanding and an unfortunate portrayal of Luther that you often get, which I think is more of a caricature than anything else, which is faith is intellectual assent. And it's intellectual assent to some set of facts, and that's it. So that there are these facts of this is what Jesus did. It was just this kind of legal transaction, and I assent to the fact that that's true. No, for Luther, faith saves because faith grasps Christ, and Christ is so intimately tied to faith that he is present within the act of faith, so that there is a real union with Jesus that occurs within faith itself. And that I think helps to solve a lot of, I think, the caricatures that you tend to have. And, I've written on this with relationship to portrayals you get in some New Testament scholars like N.T. Wright, for example, who, N.T. Wright has this criticism of Luther where, he says, righteousness is not something that can be, divorced from Jesus, like some kind of a gas or something in the courtroom, of like as if it's this like quality that he has that he just kind of takes outside of himself and we receive it. it's something more intimate than that, right? It is Jesus giving himself to us.
Yeah, and so there's this strong emphasis in Luther of that one of the defining elements of divine love is that it's self-giving. You know, God
Yes.
is the giver of gifts and he is the gift.
Yes.
And so how would Luther have understood the sort of the metaphysics of that or the broad spiritual parameters of what it means for Christ to dwell in the soul of the believer?
Yeah, the question of metaphysics with Luther is always difficult because I think it's very clear that Luther was not a metaphysician. He was never pretending to be. Though, with that being said, especially in Luther's early writings, when he deals with scholastic philosophy, he seems to know it pretty well. You know, I
Yeah.
think though those weren't his primary concerns in his writing, I think he did have a pretty good grasp on philosophy,
Yeah.
more than he's often given credit for. But you have to look at Luther's own influences, I think, to his own spiritual influence, the people that he himself cites as helping him to form his perspective on the Christian life as a whole, and justification in particular. And if you look at the authors that he tends to cite the most, you've got a few of them. Saint Augustine, of course, is the most well known. He was an Augustinian friar, and Luther often quoted Augustine. Everybody knows that. But beyond Augustine, you have John Tauler, the German mystical preacher that was highly influential on Luther. Luther cited him very frequently, and we actually have the annotated volumes of Tauler that Luther himself had, and we can see the notes that he took on Tauler. And something that Luther often did in his writings, or when he's reading other writings, he'd look at theological claims and he'd write yes or no in the margins to say if he agreed with it or not. And it's been noted that when he's writing on Tauler, it's pretty much entirely yes that he writes. He's not disagreeing significantly with Tauler. So John Tauler was a German mystic, a very practical and a very Neoplatonic kind of thinker. You see Bernard of Clairvaux is another significant influence on Luther, and Luther called him Pater Bernardus, right, Father Bernard, because he saw Bernard kind of as his spiritual father, though obviously he didn't know him personally, as they were divided by a number of years, but theologically and spiritually, he always looked up to Bernard as a significant figure. And I think there's no question of the mystical nature of Bernard's writings. And his work on loving God is a classic that I've continually revisited, as well as his sermons on the Song of Songs, and I think that's really where Luther draws this common bridal imagery that he uses, this imagery of the believer as the bride and Christ as the bridegroom, and there's this intimacy, I think, that stands there. So you've got Bernard, and then you have the anonymous work that Luther himself calls the Theologia Germanica, right? The German theology that he republishes and popularizes. And we don't know exactly who wrote the German theology, probably a 14th century work of some kind that is likely written by a student of Tauler. But it is a really weird book. It's one that our publishing house republishes. We republished some Tauler as well to kind of try to get some of those influences on Luther himself to get more widely read, because I think they're essential for understanding Luther. When you look at the German theology, I have noted that there's a very significant difference between how Luther looks at that text and how Calvin looks at that text. Calvin refers to that book as spiritual poison at one point. And Luther says at one point that there is nothing that we have taught that's not found in that book. And so that shows you that they have a bit of a different attitude. There's something in that particular text that makes Luther praise it and Calvin hate it. So what is that? And I would say that it is that kind of Neoplatonic type of mystical background that Luther draws on and that Luther loves, that Calvin is very skeptical of. So I do think that Luther is really best understood as a mystical theologian. I don't think that Luther is an anti-metaphysical theologian. Some people do take him that way. Some people take him as a more nominalist theologian. I don't personally think that's accurate. I think that he is Metaphysics is not his primary concern, but if you could nail down a metaphysic, I would say that Luther largely relies on a Neoplatonic one, and I think there's evidence of that in the Heidelberg Disputation, for example, which is so the Heidelberg Disputation is one of Luther's early disputations, 1518. It's often cited today. There are a number of works since the kind of mid 20th century that have been written on that. And it's a series of two sets of theses. And the first set of theses are the theological theses, and the second are the philosophical ones. Well, the theological ones are the ones that everybody talks about. Those are also the only ones translated into English. A friend of mine, Eric Phillips, translated the others, the philosophical theses. I don't know when the heck they're actually being published. He translated them like 5 years ago, but so one of these days it'll be out. But when you read the philosophical theses, Luther explains why it is that he's not a fan of Thomas Aquinas, right? And I think that's everybody kind of knows that. And their question as to whether he really understands Thomas or not. But regardless, he's very critical of Aristotle. But if you read the philosophical theses, Luther seems to make it pretty clear that the reason he doesn't like Aristotle is that Aristotle was not enough of a realist. And Luther seems to be very committed to a much more Platonic approach. And in that way, probably has more in common with the Eastern Fathers than, the Western medieval scholastics.
Yeah, and actually, I remember reading this in your book on this topic, where the one on Christification,
Yeah.
where basically, no, tell us, anyways, people who know you know it, but
Yeah.
yeah, but it's basically this. You talk about how Palamas is very Neoplatonic,
Yeah.
how just the Eastern Church is Neoplatonic. And so it's interesting that you see that specific parallel. So this actually, you had brought up an interesting point that I was hoping to discuss, but you talk about and some of the influences on Luther were not always um, received in the most positive way by
Yeah.
the other reformers. And when you really begin to understand the concept of theosis or deification, there's a variety of degrees of mysticalness that you can read into the concept.
Yes.
Um, but how did Luther's view on theosis compare to that of some of the other reformers? It could be Calvin or Zwingli or even other people in the Lutheran tradition, like Melanchthon, or people in the immediate aftermath of Luther, like the Protestant scholastics. How is Luther more explicit, less explicit? What are some of the differences in the details about Luther's view as opposed to that of the other Protestant scholars? Or
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So when you're looking at Protestant approaches to theosis in recent scholarship, you have people from all sorts of different traditions trying to defend a kind of theosis or trying to make parallels to, which makes sense. It comes out of a lot of these kind of ecumenical dialogues that are happening. So you have those who are trying to argue for maybe a connection between, say, John Wesley's idea of Christian perfection and theosis, or John Calvin's doctrine of union with Christ and theosis. I think that you probably have a bit of a harder time with Calvin in some ways than you do with someone like Wesley. I think some in the later Reformed tradition are much more open to more mysticism than Calvin is. But at the
yeah,
same time, actually, Calvin was highly influenced by Bernard of Clairvaux. And when citing Bernard, Calvin's a little more open at times to being a little bit mystical. I think he's a little more less okay with the mystical nature of things than Luther. I think some of that is Calvin's very legally oriented mind. I think that's just
yeah,
kind of the way that he thinks. I would say that Melanchthon probably has a little bit of that kind of Calvin, not that he would disagree with Luther, but I do think he has a little more of that legal orientation probably than Luther does in the way that Calvin does, which is probably partially why Melanchthon is a little kinder to Calvin than Luther would have been had they interacted, I think. So I'm no expert on Zwingli on this particular issue. I know that Zwingli and I don't know if Zwingli really wrote a lot on this issue. I'm actually not sure. The reading of Zwingli I've done is usually on the Lord's Supper, but at least in terms of areas of the supper in discussions with Luther, he was certainly more of a a rationalist in some ways. I don't mean that in the strongest sense, but I think he had rationalist kind of leanings. That Luther was much more open to mystery. So that's just the nature of Luther in general. I think he's very open to mystery. He loves mystery. He revels in mystery in many ways. In terms of then the later Lutheran tradition, though, Luther himself does not, form the whole Lutheran tradition. Luther, and I think, unfortunately, some people do tend to identify Lutheranism with Luther himself, and I guess it makes sense because his name ended up in our name. But but at the same time, I like to say, like, our tradition is a very rich one. We've got lots of different theologians and writers and pastors and authors of hymns, and it's not just Luther, right? Any more than your tradition would be just Thomas Aquinas, right? You've got a lot more, obviously, in your tradition than just that. So if you look at the later Lutheran tradition, this emphasis on union with Christ really did not go away. And I know that I probably differ from some of the Finnish authors who have done research on Luther, in that they seem to have a perspective on Lutheran history that is a little bit of one of decline in this area. That they tend to think that Lutheranism lost a lot of what you see in Luther here, and I just don't think that's the case. I think when you do look at the history of Lutheran writing, and I'm talking post-Reformation through about 1930. That's because there's a kind of a shift in understanding that happens. Well, it happens before that time, but it becomes more comprehensive, I guess, at that time. That you've got mystical language all over the place. So if you read something like Johann Gerhard, for example, in his Sacred Meditations, and Gerhard is, for those who aren't familiar with the major theologians of the Lutheran tradition, it is often said that there are 3 Lutheran theologians in a list of whom there is no fourth, and that is Martin Luther, Martin Chemnitz, and Johann Gerhard. It's like they're kind of undoubtedly the key figures for the Lutheran tradition. I would probably say Melanchthon really should be there too, but if you're going to identify the key figures, you've got those 4 basically. So if you're looking at the most popular piece of, well, maybe besides Arndt's True Christianity, which is very mystical, but besides that, of kind of devotional literature, you have Johann Gerhard's Sacred Meditations. Now, throughout the Sacred Meditations, Gerhard consistently talks about partaking of the divine nature. A lot. I mean, it comes up over and over again, and that's true in all of his devotional writings. Not as much in his more scholastic theological writings, but in terms of practical piety, it's everywhere. And he talks about, for example, he's got a quote in there where he says, "The divine feast makes us divine men." So he is very clearly using this language of us becoming divine, and he does it repeatedly. Now, after Gerhard, there is a bit of a debate among Lutherans regarding the nature of mysticism and our union with God, because you get people like Caspar Schwenkfeld, and you've got some of these people that are basically kind of pantheists. They're going way too far with this idea of union and adopting a kind of almost apotheosis of we become one person with God or something. There's a total kind of absorption into divinity. And the good thing about heresy, if there's a good thing about heresy, is that it does force theologians, to more carefully articulate what it is that they believe and put boundaries around the things that they say. And so that controversy, I think, actually really helped the Lutheran tradition, in that you then have all of these Lutheran theologians within that era of Protestant orthodoxy or Protestant scholasticism, which is largely the 17th century, where now all of them have a separate treatment of the mystical union, which is really, when we're talking theosis, the mystical union is kind of the category that we use historically that fits that topic. So everybody has a whole section on the mystical union, and you've got a very clearly laid out set of, I'd say, boundaries around which we can talk about it. And that's largely what the Lutheran theologians at least do, is in this way, maybe you could say it's kind of, apophatic, where we're speaking more about what it's not than what it is. We acknowledge it's this mysterious, the kind of language they use is, they use words like interpenetration between the natures, the human and divine nature. But the boundaries are there, similar to what you have with the two natures in Chalcedon, which is we're not saying this. It's not, the union is not in this way, not in this way, not in this way. Yeah.
And so I guess this actually leads to two interesting points. And the first is, what would you see as the major point of development in the Lutheran tradition post-Luther? Like, what is the biggest point of development? It could be deviating from the Lutheran
Mhm.
view. It could be simply a deepening of Luther's view. But what do you see as that big point of development on the topic of deification or the mystical union?
Yeah, I think probably the most important development is simply the kind of clear demarcation of the distinction between justification and what we're calling mystical, what they call mystical union, which is really kind of theosis. So for Luther, you can find statements in Luther on justification that are not really forensic. And Luther has not yet made the clear differentiations that happen in later Lutheranism, which I think just kind of makes sense. That's just the case with any, theological development or movement, is that, the second generation is gonna go through and kind of make the language more specific, right? So, and I think you could say that with, look at the, earliest fathers who were talking about, the nature of the Son in relation to the Father. If you look at a Justin Martyr, or even in, Origen, like, the Orthodox theology is there, but some of the language is, it takes a little bit to just be clarified, So I think with Luther, that's the case. So I don't see any, I think the elements of what becomes that doctrine of mystical union within Lutheran theology as it develops post-Luther, I think all of it's really there in Luther. It's just a matter of really clarifying terms more than anything else.
Yeah. And so this also leads to the second point, because in Luther and in the Lutheran tradition, you do see this notion of deification presented sometimes in even somewhat strong terms. And
Yeah.
but this then leads, of course, to the question of how do you separate the concept of theosis from pantheism, apotheosis,
Yeah.
the Mormon view, for example. And in Catholicism, you do see this following Aquinas, you do see this notion of a the participated likeness. There's
Yeah.
Aquinas goes into, and even more so, the people influenced by Aquinas go into very deep detail about the nature of participation and how the divine is and always remains a reality sort of distinct from, outside of, transcendent of man. To say that man participates in God means that man is somehow derivative of or dependent on God, that we are united to God, but we're united to a reality sort of outside of us, and we are more deeply conformed to this reality. We do There is a certain union between man, to my understanding, between man and sort of the inner life of God, but it's an analogous participation. We don't participate in the divine nature in the same manner or to the same extent as the three persons in the Trinity. So you see this notion of analogy, participation, sort of as the key, the metaphysical keys in the, at least in the Thomistic tradition, in the Orthodox tradition, and in those Eastern Catholic traditions that acknowledge Thomas as a saint, because some of them do, but not all of them do. You see this, like, the essence energies distinction.
Yeah.
So Luther, as he said, Luther probably knew more about metaphysics than we give him credit for, but that really was not the focus of his thoughts. But just, if it's a little difficult to talk about Luther specifically, you can maybe still talk about the Lutheran tradition at large. But whether it be in Luther, the broader Lutheran tradition, what is that metaphysical key, or that spiritual or theological key that distinguishes theosis from theism or Mormonism?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So clearly, when we are using that kind of language of becoming divine, like you see in someone like Johann Gerhard, certainly we always have to be careful that we're not using it in that Mormon sense, that we are of the same kind of being that God is. This is the Mormon saying, as man now is, God once was, and as God now is, man will become. So that's Lorenzo Snow's couplet that defines kind of that Mormon notion of what would really be an apotheosis. Well, so that's always, of course, been rejected, and we do see there are leanings toward that with people like Schwenkfeld and some others. And as soon as those ideas arise, the Orthodox Lutheran theologians make it very, very clear that that's not what they're saying. So of course, there are different ways to approach how this boundary is to be set. How is it that we are to say you are a partaker of God without actually becoming God in that sense? And the East generally has that essence energy distinction. The essence energy distinction is not one that is prominent among Lutheran theologians. However, there is what you will find in Johannes Quenstedt, I believe, or is it Abraham Kalov? No, I'm confusing them. Or maybe they actually both do this in their treatments of the mystical union, and they're the two probably most scholastic of any of the Lutheran scholastic theologians. The kind of toward the end of that scholastic era. But I think maybe it's both of them that use the language of energetic presence. There is an energetic presence of God. So and they're getting some of that language from the Eastern Fathers. So you may be able to argue that there are some traces of that. But by and large, the Lutheran tradition has, especially through the influence of Gerhard, adopted a very strongly Thomistic doctrine of simplicity. So if you read someone like Gerhard, I mean, he basically just reiterates all of the arguments from Aquinas in terms of divine simplicity, and in that very strong Thomistic doctrine of simplicity doesn't really fit with an essence energy distinction very well. So for the most part, I would say that we have tended to really have kind of the same basic answers that someone from a Thomistic tradition probably would. We certainly talk about analogy, the analogia entis. That's certainly going to form how we think about certain things. Probably the one real uniqueness of how Lutherans are going to speak about this in terms of how we can share in God without actually becoming, in essence, God in an apotheosis kind of sense, is in our Christology. And this is a place where we do differ both from the Reformed tradition as well as from Thomas and the later Roman Catholic tradition, is that in Luther's doctrine of the two natures of Christ, there's an understanding that the human nature of Christ exercises divine attributes, or the divine nature itself operates in and through the human nature, so that there is a kind of communion or sharing of attributes. So within a Lutheran system, we would say that, for example, divine omnipresence is shared with the humanity of Christ, so that we could say that Christ's human nature is omnipresent. Now, there are all sorts of clarifications around that. We don't say that that's true of necessity. It's not like that it has to be the case, but we would say it's a gift, is the language that Martin Chemnitz, for example, uses. So we have this very strong doctrine of a kind of sacramental connection between the divine and created things. And if in our theology we are willing to say that there is this communication of divine attributes from the divine to the human nature of Christ in such a way that we wouldn't say that the humanity of Christ becomes anything other than humanity. We'd say it still remains its full humanity. Because we see the roots of this in Christology, we would apply some of those same principles in theosis as well, to say that, well, within Christ and within our understanding of the two natures of Christ, you have this intimate sharing which does not negate the humanity of Christ. So this similar intimacy, which is not as they're very clear to distinguish between the hypostatic union and our mystical union, but which is very intimate and real, but not a personal union in the same way. We wouldn't have an issue saying that also does not necessarily lead to that kind of pantheistic conclusion. So in many ways, we are much more open to just kind of saying, well, we just know it's not because Scripture says so. And I guess, which maybe is not a philosophically satisfactory answer, but But to some extent, we say all I know is that there's a distinction between the divine nature in itself and what it means to participate in the divine nature.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's two very pertinent points that you seem to raise here. And I think, like you talk about in the Lutheran view, theosis as Christification. And I think
Yeah,
there is a very strong Christological emphasis in Luther and in
very
Lutheranism.
much so.
Um, but I think in some sense, you could argue that this is a product of Chalcedonian Christology in general, because when you look at,
Sure.
and I guess you could also trace it back to even Cyril's anti-Nestorian works, because
Hmm.
Chalcedon was kind of completing Ephesus. But when you look at Chalcedon, and when you look at, like, especially Pope St. Leo's defense of Chalcedon, and you end up seeing this notion eventually developed by Aquinas of, like, of capital grace, that Christ's
Sure.
humanity is sort of the vessel through which we receive grace, that through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we become united to Christ's humanity. So what Christ's divinity did to his humanity, to some sense, happened to us. Like, that's why we
Yes.
say Christ is like us in all things but sin. You know, human nature in Christ was perfected, and Christ's humanity becomes the point of contact between the human and the divine. And so, do
Yeah.
you see sort of the broad framework of Christology as being um, a like a possible point of ecumenical contact between Lutherans, other Protestants, and then Protestants and non-Protestants, in sort of discussing their view on deification?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah, 100%, absolutely. And I think that's what's most key for Luther is that the Christological grounding that you have there. And if you're talking Christology, you mentioned Cyril. I think Cyril's work on the unity of Christ is for Lutherans, that's probably our primary text. If we're going to look at Christology and how the two natures relate, our Christology is very Cyrillian. Is that, I don't know, is that a word? But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Martin Chemnitz, for example, in his work on the two natures of Christ, which is kind of the standard Lutheran text on the issue. I mean, he's mostly drawing on Cyril and John of Damascus. Those are really the two most significant figures for us Christologically. So anything that we do say about deification or theosis ultimately is going to be rooted in Christ. So yeah, absolutely, this is something that lays a pretty significant groundwork for ecumenical dialogue, and I think theosis does in general. And that's the great thing about this discussion is that it does, I think, allow for, like, when we're talking to somebody from all these different Christian traditions, and those traditions that have at least roots within the patristic era, those much more historically oriented groups. We all do have this kind of common ground, right? Of saying, well, we all partake of the divine nature. We all acknowledge that, but then we've got the particulars that help us to see, how do our traditions relate? How do we take this emphasis and maybe do things a little differently here or there? And I think the Christological founding is certainly going to be the most important there, because we're, at least for Chalcedonian churches, maybe for the Copts, it might be a little different, but we have our roots there, certainly with the fathers, especially through Chalcedon. Yeah, so I think that there is a significant amount of really ecumenical potential there. But I will say that Christological understanding that we have, especially that Luther has, is also, though, what does lead towards some skepticism of certain formulations of theosis. And that's going to be largely the major concern for someone like Luther. And we see this in the way that Luther looks at the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius. And here is where I do make that distinction between the what I say is that the strongly Neoplatonic view of theosis versus a more Christological one. And that's not because our view is not in any way Neoplatonic. I think that those emphases and influence is still there. I mean, Augustine certainly, was Neoplatonic, but the main issue with Dionysius for Luther is he says that he Platonizes more than he Christianizes. And I think that really, that particular quote, I think really summarizes the Lutheran concern in these issues, is to make sure that there is a Christological rootedness. So our emphasis tends to be on first the kind of redemptive historical reality of the hypostatic union, and everything's got to be rooted there. And so whatever we do say about this notion of theosis, it has to be very much Christ-centered. And this is something that I noted in Christification, and this is also through reading some Eastern sources, that there's a recognition that there are different streams of kind of theosis language in the Fathers. And you do have your Pseudo-Dionysius, who is certainly, I think, less focused on the divine economy, if really at all. And then you have people like Irenaeus and Athanasius, who are, when they're speaking about theosis kind of language, they're very much talking incarnation. It's very Christological. And so we're certainly going to gravitate more toward the Athanasius, Irenaeus kind of writings than we are towards the kind of Pseudo-Dionysius type writings.
Yeah, and you do mention that of like the Eastern Church has what, and I believe you use this term of a more cosmic approach to
Yeah.
deification as opposed to a more Christologically oriented
Yeah.
view on deification. And a lot of contemporary Orthodox thought tends to be born out of a synthesis of these two views.
Yes,
Um,
very much so.
but, but they're drawing on two very specific streams within the early church. And you bring up like Nalus as a good example of a contemporary
Yeah.
Lutheran who's more Christological. But it's interesting because you would say Lutherans are more Christologically oriented. And me personally, I mean, in my own studies, a lot of what I a lot of the biggest influences for deification on me have been the looking at like the effects of the incarnation, and then also looking
Yes.
at like sort of the metaphysics of the afterlife, so to speak. Like looking at, what does it mean for humanity to participate in the divine without being by nature divine? Like what does it mean for us to be
Sure.
specifically by grace, what Christ is by nature? Um, so in a sense, I do kind of appreciate where you're coming from. But this also, you had brought up a point earlier of the Lutheran tradition is very strong about the notion of there being a difference between God as he is in himself and God as he is sort of in his relationship to us. And there are some scholars that note that, and I've seen a lot of different people kind of say this, that you see later philosophical trends that are read back into Luther, like the
Yes.
concept of simul justus et peccator from the 19th century on is very much interpreted in an existential sense. And so you do see some people who would see Luther as a prelude to Kant, that you can't really, in the Kantian metaphysics and epistemology, you can't really know God as he is in himself. You can only know God in his effects. And that sort of comes from a corruption of the Thomistic view, not the Thomistic, but the Lutheran view, with the Lutheran criticism of the theology of glory and the Lutheran, affirmation of the sort of paradoxical way in which God makes himself manifest. He defeats death in being subject to death and sin. He manifests his strength in weakness. And so, would you mind giving a little bit more of a sort of a testimony to that, talking a little bit about, that element of the Lutheran view, or?
Yeah. So it is true that someone like Kant, I mean, he does come from a German pietist home, which is pietism being a movement from within Lutheranism. And so there are certainly Lutheran influences on somebody like Immanuel Kant. However, that doesn't mean I think that Kant is being consistent with Luther. I think that there is a tendency to read Luther through a Kantian lens that I think is really a misunderstanding of what Luther himself was actually saying about a number of things. Now, you bring up the theology of the cross, theology of glory distinction. That distinction has basically no relevance to the entirety of the Lutheran tradition prior to the 20th century. I mean, it's not even referenced in Luther's writings past his Heidelberg Disputation. It's never been a major category of our theology. The all of a sudden, especially with the rise of Karl Barth and neo-orthodoxy, there's a book on Luther's theology of the cross by Walter von Leeuwenhoek, and there are some really good things I like about the book, and I think there are some. I don't think the distinction is totally irrelevant or anything. I think that there are helpful. There's some helpful things in the distinction that Luther makes here, but reading that text, he almost tries. This is my read of the text, at least. So some may disagree with my read of that text, but I tend to think that he tries really hard to make Luther sound like a pre-Barth figure.
Yeah.
And Barth loves the paradoxes, and Luther does love paradoxes too. So I'm not saying that that's totally wrong, but I think there is a bit of overdoing it to some extent in making those distinctions that happens because of a lot of the conversations that are happening in the 20th century. So any approach that takes that theology of glory, theology of the cross distinction and makes it kind of paradigmatic for understanding anything in Lutheran theology, I don't think is fair to Luther or the tradition after him. But regarding the Kant specifically, and this is something that Tuomo Mannermaa and some of the Finnish scholars are going to say, and I think rightly so, is that there's a major shift in how Luther is understood through the writings of Albert Ritschl. Ritschl being the most significant of the Protestant liberals in Germany after Schleiermacher. And Ritschl writes a couple different books that address Luther's theology. And one of these, two major works, and they're actually multi-volume works. And the one is the History of the Doctrine of Reconciliation, and then the other is his History of Pietism, where he's very critical of mysticism. He does not like anything mystical or metaphysical in any way at all. Now, Ritschl was very clearly, and even self-professedly, a neo-Kantian. So he's very influenced by the ideas of particularly Hermann Lotze, who's a neo-Kantian philosopher. And so Ritschl is the one who I think really makes that strong divide between God as he is in himself and us actually knowing anything about God, basically just through his effects. To say that we only have the effects of God, especially through the aligning of our moral wills with God's moral will. And with Ritschl, you get this reading of Luther that says that when Luther talks about union with Christ, he's not talking about anything metaphysical, but what he really means is that we align our moral will with God's will. So it becomes simply ethical and nothing else. And that reading that Ritschl has of Luther is really through the lens of Kant, and then it becomes foundational for the Luther Renaissance of the 20th century, with Karl Hull being the most significant, Paul Althaus being kind of connected there too as a very significant Luther interpreter, but Althaus I think is a lot better than Hull is. But the influence of Ritschl's ideas influence what becomes the Luther Renaissance, which set the groundwork for all Luther scholarship throughout the 20th century. So I think that's how these kind of presuppositions of Kant filtered through. So that doesn't mean that everyone who does Luther scholarship, who doesn't see the mystical language, is purposefully reading Kant into Luther, but it has been so deeply embedded in the scholarship that prior to Mannermaa, I think it was almost just taken for granted.
So the last big question that I have, well, actually, I guess I would have to. I thought there was one more I also want to ask. So,
sure.
Mostly, how is the concept of deification or theosis accepted among most Protestant scholars today? Because there's no, I mean, even within Catholicism, there's a certain level of intellectual diversity, and there's even more within Protestantism, because there's not like a pope of Protestantism. And so I've seen the concept of deification, welcomed with open arms in some Protestant circles. And then I've seen other, like I think this was from either R.C. Sproul or John MacArthur, who talk about, deification, theosis, as at least understood by the East, is this as a sort of warping of the to what the traditional biblical and the historical Christian concept of the glorification of the saints. And then you see everything from those two views to just a sense of complete ignorance of the concept of theosis and everything in between. But what is the general state of Protestantism, or what are some common trends in Protestantism? Is there a majority opinion, or is there any kind of popular opinions emerging amidst the diversity concerning how to make use of the concept of deification?
Yeah, so there is a lot of diversity, and there's a lot of diversity even within what you're calling Protestantism as a whole, because there's so many different groups that are under that label. So of course there are going to be so many different perspectives, and I will say that in my own kind of reading or the circles that I'm in, generally when I speak about different Protestant groups, I'm talking Lutheran, Anglican, and the Confessional Reformed. Those are really the groups that I spend a significant amount of time reading and interacting with, because they are groups that are more historically tied. So ones that actually have historical rooting, care about the ecumenical creeds. When you kind of go outside of that, I in many ways just kind of lose interest. So I'm not not as well versed in probably the John MacArthur types, who I'm sure would be, at least in my experience, the more John MacArthur types. And I don't want to include all Baptists either, because I think there are actually a lot of Baptists that I know that are very Catholic in orientation in their reverence for the history of the church and things like that. But yeah, I think among probably the John MacArthur types, those who are not liturgically oriented in any way, I think it pretty much, at least in my experience, I just encounter nothing but skepticism. You just kind of throw it out and don't talk about it at all. That's at least from my experience, that's the case. I think though so we've got those three groups that I mentioned, and you could talk about the Wesleyans too, because I know the Methodists have done some work on this, but I'm not as well read there, so I don't know that I would be able to comment very well, but I know there's a bit of a revival there. Among Lutherans, Anglicans, and some of the Confessional Reformed, I would say theosis does seem to have a lot more traction, than it did 20 years ago, say. There's been a lot more published consistently on the subject. Within the Lutheran tradition, which obviously is what I know the best, it's an area of debate, right? This is, when I published Christification, that book sparked a lot of discussion, and not all of it was favorable toward my work, right? So you do, I think, have really two divergent attitudes within Lutheranism, and I think this is similar attitudes are there within other traditions too, but you have this division between a Lutheranism that is really indebted to that kind of Kantian approach, that influence of ritual, and one that is much more patristic and Catholic in orientation, that is okay with metaphysics and thinks these things are good and necessary to talk about. So I'd say the Lutheran world, at least, is pretty strongly divided along those lines. I tend to see among Anglicans, in my experience, a lot more acceptance of theosis. I don't see even a lot of pushback in the same way against it. And within Reformed circles, I think that their version of theosis, if they have it, is always a little more moderate. I'll just say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does seem like, the groups that I've met that are the most into deification or theosis tend to either be more ecumenically, not necessarily liberal, but ecumenically oriented Lutherans who see certain parallels between Luther's soteriology or just the general mindset of the Reformation, like specifically the Reformation and its immediate aftermath, and like Eastern views, or to a lesser extent Catholicism. And so they see theosis as that great means of facilitating ecumenical dialogue. But then you also see groups that, again, maybe they're into ecumenism, maybe they're not, but usually more conservative Lutherans, but like of the variety that, again, tend to take that interest in church history and the church fathers. And those tend to be the two groups of Lutherans who tend to take the biggest interest in theosis.
Yeah. Yeah, I just don't think you can really read the fathers and not have a concept of theosis. You've got to do something with it. So I would say that I don't think the question is really, is there theosis? The question is, well, what is theosis? Because I think it's to me, if you're going to say that only the Eastern Church has theosis and nobody in the West has it. This is not a Western doctrine. Well, what you're really doing is giving all the fathers to the East because they all talk about it.
Yeah.
I just don't think that I don't know how you can do that, and I don't know how you can do it biblically either. So, yeah, I think that it is probably true that the traditions that are more sacramental, the traditions that are more liturgically oriented, are going to be those that emphasize theosis much more. Especially, I think, sacramental theology, and I think there's a connection there because sacramental theology is based upon a recognition of the union between divine work and physical things. So, if you've got that kind of concept already with the waters of holy baptism or the with the Eucharist, with the elements of bread and wine, then of course it makes total sense to say that God kind of works in us in a similar mystical way.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I'm actually there's a fair. You mentioned that the liturgical Christians tend to have a much stronger emphasis on deification. Um, uh, actually, I'm trying to look up the specific prayer, but I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Catholic Mass. But there's a part of the Mass where the priest mixes the water and the wine. And the reason I'm looking it up is because I want to get the exact wording correctly. But it's
Okay.
by the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. And so it's interesting how you mentioned that fact of, again, the more liturgical Christian groups tend to be the ones that also put the most emphasis on deification. And in my opinion, it's also partly because, through the sacraments, we, in a finite way, participate in what
Yeah,
we participated in a fuller way in the afterlife, you know?
exactly. For
Yeah.
sure.
But I guess this leads to the last main question I would want to ask. So we started off with a more general view of deification. We talked about how deification relates to justification. We talked about different ways Lutheran theologians have attempted to sort of work out this problem. But now let's end by getting into the more specific or particular elements. So keeping in mind everything we just discussed, what how would you define the uniquely Lutheran view on deification?
Yeah. So I've used the term Christification. As mentioned before, that's the name of my book, and it's not like the term Christification is brand new with me. I mean, some Eastern writers have, as I cite, have used that term as well. But I think it is the best term to use to speak about a Lutheran concept of deification because we are Christ-centered. We are Christ-centered in nearly everything that we do. I mean, for Luther's theology, everything is understood through the lens of Christ. So that kind of Christological emphasis is probably what's going to be unique in our approach to something like theosis. So the Christification term just kind of it fits that emphasis pretty well. Now, as I think through the Lutheran distinctives, as we're talking about theosis, particularly as it's described usually as with the term mystical union in our history, I don't know that there is any one element of that I would look at and say, well, here's an area where Lutherans totally differ from everybody else. So I don't know that there's a point that I would say, here's a place where we talk about this, and your tradition or the Eastern tradition would say that's wrong. I don't think that's really the case, but probably that maybe two uniquenesses, I suppose, if I was going to point to any, besides just the general Christological centrality there. The one is, of course, just that we are always going to view that kind of participation in view of justification. So we're always going to have this forensic justification in the background as that which kind of, in a way, roots everything else. And in the way that the reason we would say that it roots everything else is not just because forensic metaphors are way more important, but instead it's because the verdict of justification, we would say, is a perfect verdict, and whatever kind of Christification I experience is imperfect. And it will be perfect, but it's not yet. So we kind of see that perfection and justification as grounding or rooting everything else. So that becomes the basis. Because I am already righteous in Christ, because I've been given his righteousness and I'm forgiven, now I can walk in Christ, and now I can participate in this process, knowing that my assurance is in Christ and what He's done. So that rootedness first in the forensic declaration of justification is going to be unique there. And the second thing, I guess, that would be unique about the Lutheran approach is just in our Christology, in that we do have this idea of the communication of attributes within the incarnation itself that is going to root a lot of the conversations that we have.
Yeah, so it seems like the unique or the distinctives of Lutheranism are sort of this balance of a forensic and a progressive view of salvation and
Yeah.
its strong rootedness in Christology.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
Well, that's actually a very interesting point, and certainly, I mean, in my own studies, this is an ongoing thing, and I love to expand upon my view of deification and sort of by comparing different views on deification. And I would like to thank you so much for contributing to my journey on this and the journey of anyone who may listen to this video. So again, thank you very much, Dr. Cooper, for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. It was fun.
You're welcome.